This is Media Sales Mastery, the podcast for media sales professionals. In each episode, we bring you information, insights, and ideas from some of the industry's top thought leaders. Connect with us to help pick the topic and guide the show.
This is Media Sales Mastery, the podcast for media sales professionals. I'm your host, Jamie Wood, and we are back with part 2 of Dark Arts of Media Sales and Internal Politics, part 2. We had a great time with Rob Atkinson on the first episode, got into a lot of the really heavy stuff, played out some different scenarios. This is an extension of that episode. We're going to start to dive into a little bit more of those kind of, those scenarios that come up a lot and give some real specific tactical advice. Just a bit of a recap too, Rob is actually a former CEO of mine. He was a CEO when I worked at ARN in Australia. He's worked all throughout UK, through Europe. He's an executive. He works on many, many boards. He does a lot of advisory work and really, really great guy. So really, really pleased to have a chance to talk to Rob once again, covering off the world of internal politics.
The first 5.
Because today's an interesting topic, Rob. We are obviously going to be covering off organisational politics and, specifically that interplay between a media sales professional and the other departments within a media organisation. And, you as someone who's led large media companies, what's your definition of corporate politics, and why do they seem to be such a natural part of functioning or dysfunctional media company? Why are politics playing out in the ways they do?
It's often down to the shareholders and their requirements. Some of them want a quick return. Some of them have more patience and want to see the business build over a longer period of time. And I think depending on their aspirations determines what kind of corporate politics you get in a business. I've worked in businesses where they've been incredibly patient, where they've wanted to build a business brick by brick, haven't really been thinking about an exit strategy as such, or if they have, it's not been shared particularly widely. And then I've worked in businesses where, and I am doing now, where I'm writing business plans that are for the next 3 years for the owners to exit. I mean, that's their number one priority. And that will govern the way the business moves and at what speed and what rhythm and what's expected of people. And of course, when there's pressure on, particularly if you've got a timeline as specific as, let's say, 3 years to exit, then, more pressure, more politics derive as a result of that. And life gets, more difficult, more complex as a result, because of the speed of perhaps of delivery. It's always been probably the thing that, as I've moved higher up in organisations to the point where I've been a CEO and a chair, that's probably the most complex to wrestle with. It's one of those, if you get it right, then clearly the business really thrives, because there's unity all the way through from the top to the bottom. And it's true that, a fish rots from the head down. And so getting it right at the very top and making sure that everyone's aligned and everyone realises what they're doing is for the greater good of the business rather than their own individual selfish needs. They're the businesses that tend to thrive. And we saw that with Adshell. I think there was a real shared belief in what we were doing. And when you've got that, you've got all of the ingredients, as long as the product stands up, for great performance.
Was saying to you before we started recording that I was recently in Auckland for some new business meetings, and I got a chance to catch up with your and my former colleague Ben Gibb, and he spoke very highly of the culture at Adshell and just the unity and alignment, and it's that's probably something that we can unpack a bit today as we go through the course of the episode.
Media Sales Mastery.
Hey, Rob, I got a few more tricky ones for you. I like what you said earlier in our discussion around people not really bringing their real selves to work or bringing a different kind of persona to work. And, when we talk about corporate politics or organizational politics, media companies are in these perpetual states of change. We're constantly evolving, we're constantly moving, and change for a lot of people is not good, right? People lose status in changes, people lose resources in change, people lose control in change, they lose comfort. So you can understand why that environment is rife for interpersonal conflict. So I want to go through a few more of these tactical scenarios for you, and this is one that I think is probably less and less a thing in today's day and age. Maybe in some countries I've worked in recently overseas, you're in a direct sales team. There's a high level of budget activity transparency. You know the days of having your budget up on the whiteboard, having leaderboards, you know, who's done...
Still happens.
It does, yeah. And who's done this many meetings. And let's say that there's what started as a bit of healthy competition amongst the team, you notice that that's starting to create a bit of a rivalry, which has gone from being friendly into something that's a bit nasty, you know, into team competitiveness, factions, a little bit of that kind of not so nice behavior on the floor. Let's say you're a member of that team or you're the person leading that team. How do you sort of tackle something like that?
Now, this one actually occurs quite frequently still. And it all boils down, this is through years of facing this issue. And I think it all boils down to the way the team is set up in terms of remuneration. If the remuneration is predominantly individual based rather than team based, you're going to face this issue. It has to be a balance between team objectives and team bonus and remuneration and individual, because at that level, immediately the individual has got to think team and themselves, and it stops them just being selfish. I mean, I've got multiple examples of where people, when I was running newspapers in particular, where I was the inventory manager, where people would come to me and say, you've got to take this piece of business, it's absolutely essential. I knew it was because it was to get them to their individual target. And they would fight tooth and nail against other people in the team who had business which was much more profitable, much higher pricing, from clients that would fit and suit the brand much better than theirs. And it was all driven by individual and personal gain. And it caused enormous frustration. And it was the way that the teams were set up. So you've got to strike the right balance in terms of the way you remunerate to ensure that team really matters, and that you're rewarding accordingly, and then you won't see so much of that behaviour. If it continues, then I always think you've got to try and reset the goals. So this is the job of the direct sales manager, to just pull people in and get them once again to think about what is it we're trying to achieve as a department or a division, rather than at the individual, we're all contributing to this. This is the end game, and this is what we're doing, and this is why we're doing it. And then what I would do from there, I would build out SLAs, KPIs or OKRs, whatever terminology you use, to manage performance. And I would make sure that those reflected team more so than individual, because that then changes behaviour and gets people thinking much more about the good of the team and the good of the business overall than their individual needs.
That was actually really good as a setup for this next one. Let's say you've got what I call kind of like resource allocation conflicts. So maybe you share a sales coordinator with a few other reps. Perhaps you find that one of them is maybe overutilizing that resource. Maybe they're dropping a lot of urgent requests that might monopolize that person's time, or cause your request to be prioritized. That old squeaky wheel thing. How would you tackle that one if you were the rep, obviously, on the receiving end of that?
Well, I'd start with the root cause, and I'd go to the person who's monopolising your shared resource, and I'd talk to them, and just again try and talk to them about what it is that why their work is more important than yours. Try and get an understanding of why they're believing that everything they do is more important, not just than you, but the rest of the team potentially. But in this specific case, clearly it's a shared resource. Rather than go to the actual shared resource, because that person will feel incredibly conflicted and will feel in a very vulnerable position. So I would start with your peer and try and understand that, and get them to try and understand, your work is just as important, and it's got to be done. And the whole point is it's a shared resource. It's not their resource. And in most cases, I think people are reasonable. Sometimes they don't even realise that they're occupying 80% of that person's time. There may be their style is quite reactive, and therefore when something comes in, they immediately go, I need your help, or I need support. Once that's done, I would try and get to a point where you bring some process and discipline to the way that you use that person, so that their time is being allocated appropriately, rather than be very reactive, because that's what normally happens in this situation. You basically say, look, 50% of the time is allocated to you and 50% to me. Now, how you use that time is up to you, whether you want to use it all in one go or whether you want to use it over a period of time. That's up to you, but it'll help that person to become better organised for a start, because they'll have to think a bit more carefully about how they allocate the time that they've got of that, and time is precious. I've got it at the moment in a company where someone is very needy and they're constantly asking for attention, they're constantly asking for work. And the rest of the team are sort of going, this person's monopolising our one resource. And most of the time it's for information that they could find out from their computer, or they could look up on Google. It's quite basic information, but I think they must have been used to having an EA or a person or some kind of personal assistant that would do most things for them. I know I found that quite difficult when I started working on my own. I was so used to other people doing certain things for me, and it's suddenly, they're not there now. You've got to do it yourself.
No, I can relate to that.
I know, exactly. I had to think a lot more carefully about, oh God, there's no one going to set up my lunch or my meeting, or I've got to do it. And I find that takes 30% of my time now, is just organising my diary to fit, because people cancel, people move, other people want to get in your diary and they say it's urgent, and you've got to respond accordingly. So similar thing here. You've got to learn and train yourself to be better organised. And that's normally sitting at the root of the issue in situations like this.
I was going to ask you whether, and you gave a great example, whether this plays out a lot in corporate life, because I feel like really not just shared resource, but just so many different departments are cross-functional departments in a business. On any given day, I remember even as a sales director in, my role when you were my CEO at ARN, I was an operational lead in the business. I was across HR. I was across a whole bunch of other departments that weren't necessarily sales. And you were finding yourself spread quite thin and getting pulled into different projects and whatnot, just as a consequence of being the person on ground in that market. So I feel like this is actually very prevalent at all levels of corporate life in media, not just in these very specific scenarios.
Absolutely right. It doesn't change the higher you go up. You just try and manage and be disciplined to manage your time and allow the heads of divisions to have more autonomy, because if you've got the right people in place, then give them the trust, give them the autonomy to get on with their job and get out of their way. And then just make sure that when they're reporting to you, whether that's weekly, fortnightly, monthly, you ask the right questions to get the right information. It's critically important. That doesn't mean to say that your door's not open, and people should be, my personal opinion is people should be allowed to come in, and if they've got an idea or something's on their mind and you've got the time available to just walk in and share a thought with you.
Yeah.
I think that's critically important. But you're absolutely right. If you're not careful, you can get bogged down in and get too heavily involved in the day-to-day of departments where you don't have that expertise, and that means that you're not focusing on the main game. And what happens, and I find this a lot with startups, I've got, founders who are very bright, who are very open to ideas and advice and support. And the biggest thing I have to do to them all the time is say, you're working in the business instead of on the business. And they can't help themselves because it's kind of, they've never been, a lot of them have come out of university and gone straight into business. So they've never been officially trained or had that opportunity to work in organizations where there are some really sophisticated systems and processes and disciplines around that. So they've never had that opportunity. So they're learning as they go along. And I tend to find that they're the ones who are far too often caught working in the business rather than on it.
There's a great book, Rob, called Buy Back Your Time, and it specifically deals with that exact topic, particularly those entrepreneurs, early stage startup, and it talks about this whole idea of most entrepreneurs, I mean yourself included, you have a high degree of openness because you want to be open to all possibilities and whatnot. And this book really talks about that whole temptation to be an operator in the business versus actually making that shift to strategic leader and extracting yourself. It's a really, really great book, actually. I'll link it in the show notes. I got one example here that I thought would be a good one to get into, and this is probably pretty universal, but I'll give you a specific example. You go out to a client meeting, and maybe you ask a member of your creative team to accompany you. Maybe that individual who isn't typically in front of customers, maybe they make an inappropriate remark in the meeting, maybe they make a faux pas like checking their phone in the meeting, maybe they're just not dressed appropriately for a business meeting. How would you address that one? When and with whom and how?
So I would address it directly to the person who was in the meeting with you, and a bit like I do with my daughters, who are teenage daughters. You do it there and then, because otherwise they'll forget it. They'll forget and they'll have moved on. So and this has happened to me many an occasion. So what I tended to do was go straight for a coffee with that person. And my immediate thought is, I want to put them in the position of the person they were sitting opposite. So the client or whoever it might be, the supplier, and generally just say, how do you reckon that meeting went? Number one, what do you think the perception of that client was towards us? What do you think they thought when this happened? And get them to think about if someone else was sitting opposite them and they did what they did. Generally speaking, if they're smart and they're observant and they've got any empathy, they'll pick up straight away what you're getting at. And I'm sure they'll go, I wouldn't be best pleased. I'd have felt disrespected. I'd have felt that you weren't interested in me or my business. And you want them talking like this, hopefully, so that they do have that. If they haven't got that understanding, you've got a problem. They're probably in the wrong job. But if they do that, effectively, you shouldn't need to remind them of it again. They should be able to pick that up straight away and go, yeah, you're absolutely right. That was really disrespectful. And you haven't actually said that. They've come to the conclusion themselves. And they should learn from that pretty quickly. If they did it again, then we got an issue. And that's when I would talk to their line manager and say, this isn't working. This person clearly just doesn't get it. And let me give you 2 specific examples of where it's happened. And one of them, he came to the conclusion himself, or she came to the conclusion herself, and recognised that wasn't appropriate behaviour and it was disrespectful. But they went and did it again, 2 meetings later. So that's how I would deal with that. And generally speaking, people, especially if they haven't had much experience, will pick it up straight away and go, oh, yes, okay, got it, I understand. But normally when if I was going to a meeting in the first place, I'd probably, if it was someone who was more junior and perhaps hadn't had much exposure, I would probably have a word with them anyway and say, look, important client, really important to be respectful. We can we can joke, and the humour is a really important part of a meeting. If you know them, but in this case you don't, so be careful. Just be respectful Don't be distracted by your phone or by the time. Just listen intently and talk when it's appropriate. Just so that they, in the first few meetings, they do more listening than talking. Because I think that's the best way they're going to learn what the social norms are in that situation. And if they don't do that, and let's be honest, we've worked with people where they don't really get it and they continue to exert that type of behaviour, well, they're not right for the business anyway, and it's time for them to move on.
You've done this a couple of times through our conversations, Rob, where rather than making it about the salesperson versus the individual, you've actually brought the conversation back to the customer and the perception. And I think that reframe is just such a really powerful tactic in a lot of these scenarios. It's like, look, this isn't me versus you. This isn't about what Rob wants from the department or what Rob thought you did wrong. We're ultimately here to serve our clients. Let's think about what the perception or the experience was from their end. Great lesson, and probably a good segue. You did a great piece recently around 30 lessons in 30 years. I think time's a factor because we got 2 listener questions to get to, but could you distill down some of your top takeaways maybe?
Yeah, let's think. I'll give you a top 5. Just because they resonate with me and have done over the years. And people can then interpret what they want from them. The first one was something I learned when I went to run a newspaper in Ireland, and the chair at the time, I went in sort of to run the investment side, said to me, he was quite a sage old guy, and he said to me, Rob, the mind is like a parachute. It works best when it's open. And I was coming into a complete, in Ireland, they speak the same language as they do on the, in the UK, because it was a republic. But culturally, completely different, very different way of life, different idea of the world. And you have to adjust and adapt really quickly. And his comment there made me think about everything very differently. And I thought, you know what? I'm not going to impose myself on the way that these people work, even though they're a much smaller team, much smaller business. I'm going to do a lot of questions and listening and try and, appreciate what it is that really kind of is at the heart of the way that these people think. And it helped me enormously. I saw people come over following me who didn't really immerse themselves in the culture, and they really struggled. So that has lived with me for a long time. And I think anyone going into a new role or a new job or a new environment or live in a different country, if they keep that line to mind, it'll do them the power of good. The second one is one that we see a lot in the sales environment, which is a great quote, which is, a pessimist always sees the difficulty in every opportunity, whereas the optimist always sees the opportunity in every difficulty. And that to me is the perfect, criteria, because ultimately, how many times have we dealt with people who've got a fantastic opportunity staring them in the face and they find all the reasons why this isn't going to happen? So, it's a mindset that sets you in a positive mind state. And I think it sets you up really well for anything that you do, whether it's in the workplace or even in your own home life. And my third one was a classic, which is something that I'm sure many of your listeners will have heard, but often we don't always follow it, which is focus on what you can control. The rest is noise. Even when you're in a position of seniority, the number of times you will hear whispers that shareholders are looking at divesting or are looking at acquiring another business, and I used to, when I first got into that kind of lofty position, I used to let it worry me, and I was anxious. What does that mean? Does that mean a change of the guard? And in the end, someone who'd been doing it a lot longer than me said to me, just focus on what you can control. Everything else around you is white noise and you can't do anything about it. So just, if you continue to be good at what you do, then you're going to be all right, whether it's in this company or another. The fourth one is Be a learn-it-all, not a know-it-all. If not, I think you'll get really found out because you'll become complacent. It's a bit like always be paranoid. I don't necessarily agree with that, but I think a hint of paranoia is probably a good thing. I always used to say that about our competitors. They're all out to get you. And my fifth one is just be super clear about what's expected of you. Too many people in sales roles go, but I didn't realise that was what I was supposed to do. Or is that really my role? Or, right, okay, I didn't realise that fell under me. Or, how many times have we heard these or had these type of conversations? So if you're in a frontline coalface sales role from the very beginning, right through until you're the CEO, and even when you're the CEO, just ask that question: what exactly is required of me? And make sure that your line manager is super clear with you about what it is, and more importantly, how that's going to be measured. So that, you should never have any surprises, as I said before. So if you're not performing well, you'll know you're not performing well because against criteria that's been set, you're not delivering. And often it's much more than just delivering the money. It's your behaviours, it's how you support the culture of the organisation, all sorts of different criteria, as we know, go into that. But just ensure that, you're super clear about what's expected of you.
You know what I love about that, Rob? Like, those are kind of like the central tenets for this is how to operate to navigate a political environment, because whilst you need to have the techniques and the skills and the aptitude to handle those little nasty issues as they arise, it's also really important to avoid them and to be really cognizant of how you need to hold yourself and how you need to carry and conduct yourself. So I think that's a really powerful way to end this one. Okay, listener question.
I can't ask my sales manager that.
Hey Jamie, any advice for what to do when finance makes a wholesale change to the commission structure which results in your earnings being severely impacted? I don't want this to come across as me being greedy, but this new structure doesn't motivate or drive me to maximize revenue.
I actually think, Rob, I had a bit of a laugh at the greedy line, but there is something in that. If this new structure doesn't motivate me to drive the right behaviour, that is a problem. How would that one get addressed or raised?
It's a big problem, and so the first port of call, and to be honest, it's not the salesperson's responsibility for this, but It is their sales manager's responsibility, which is, can we understand why there's been this significant change? Now, generally, it's because the business has got an issue of some description. It could be the shareholders or the board are putting the CEO and the senior management team under more pressure for cash flow, for profit margin, for taking out cost in the organisation. And there are certain levers you can pull. Not many, because if you're a fixed cost business, but there's always some variable cost. And unfortunately, it's always training, learning and development and training, hospitality, travel, and bonus, which is always, what is the great strapline? It's always subject to change, and is not guaranteed. But I'm with you. I think it's a big issue. I think it's the last thing I would ever adjust, because ultimately I want hungry salespeople trying to over-deliver and earn, in some cases, and it happens, more money than me. I'm happy with that. If they're earning more money than me, my God, they must be driving a hell of a lot of business into the organisation. So from a personal point of view, in a senior position, it'd be the last thing that I would adjust, because your point is absolutely spot on. You want a team of people who are very focused and very hungry to deliver, to overperform against the numbers that they're being given. If it happens, and that is set in stone, I think you'd have to have probably a delegation of sales managers to the finance director to go, this is going to cause significant pain and potentially material damage to the business as a result of this change. And he's got to appreciate and understand that, because let's be honest, there are some fantastic FDs out there, CFOs, who are very commercially astute and have got good commercial acumen. But there's also some out there who, are fixed to a spreadsheet and a P&L, and they'll just see it as a significant saving that'll improve the top line of the business. So it's important that they're made aware of it. And in some cases, they won't have been, and they're blissfully unaware. So that's what I would do. I would definitely tackle it head on before it gets set in stone, so that you've got a point of view and a delegation to say this is going to cause us a problem, and it's important to make that upfront, so you know that this could cause us a lot of unrest. It's also going to distract from people's performance, because they're going to be spending, like I said before, focus on what you can control, not the white noise around you. Well, the white noise then takes over, and a lot of people will be focused on that. So that's what I would do, and I think it's a very valid point. And if an organisation does that, I'd probably, if I was that person, be thinking, if you can't find some kind of compromise, probably time to look for a new role.
Yeah, and unfortunately, that is the reality that happens, is these companies are still competing for talent, and the talent goes where they're rewarded and where they're appreciated.
Absolutely. And as we know, it's not just financial reward that people request and desire. It's that there's a lot more that goes alongside it. But ultimately, most successful salespeople are driven by cash. You can't, if you take away the power for them to earn, and the incentive, more importantly, for them to earn, then they're more likely going to leave. And it's always the same, as you know from your previous experience, it's always the best talent that leaves first. It's never the guys that you might be in the bottom 10% or bottom quartile who are dissatisfied and want to leave anyway. It's always the best people.
Yeah.
So why make it easy for them to leave? And making that kind of decision would.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful advice, Rob. That brings us to the end, mate. We got into a lot here. It was so good to catch up after all these years. I really enjoyed our time together at ARN, Rob, and it was great to obviously pick your brain a little bit for the audience. Is there any sort of parting thought you want to leave everybody with? Something to maybe take away this week around the world of dark arts of media sales and internal politics?
Well, hopefully I've left a few learnings and a few ideas, practical tips for how you do it. The one thing I would say, whatever lofty position you get to in the future, you're always selling. As CEO, I was selling to a board of directors, I was selling to shareholders, I was selling to my internal team, and I was selling to my suppliers and my clients. It never stopped. And it still never stops, because I'm still selling now in order to get work. So well. That's I think successful business people and entrepreneurs, they set their foundation on being able to influence people, and that's selling. Let's be honest.
I love it. Rob, thanks so much.
Okay, enjoyed.